The merciless midday sun blazed down upon the vast Arizona desert with an intensity that could crack stones and bleach bones white within hours, when cowboy Ezekiel Martinez witnessed something that would forever change the course of multiple lives and send ripples of consequence through the entire territory. The heat waves rising from the scorched earth created shimmering mirages that danced across the horizon, making it difficult to distinguish reality from illusion. But what Ezekiel saw that fateful day was no desert phantom, but rather a scene of cruelty so profound that it would haunt him for years to come. In the distance, beneath the sparse and withering shade of a dying mesquite tree, that had long since surrendered its green leaves to the unforgiving climate, something moved with the feeble desperation of a creature clinging to its last threads of life. At first glance through the distorted air, Ezekiel thought perhaps it was merely a wounded coyote, or maybe a desert hare caught in some natural predicament. But as his weathered boots carried him closer across the burning sand, each step revealed details that transformed his initial curiosity into a mounting horror that gripped his chest like iron bands. What he discovered there in that desolate patch of hell on earth was a young colt, a beautiful bay-colored foal of barely 3 months old, so emaciated that every single rib showed through his dull coat like the bars of a prison made of bone and suffering. The animal's once glossy hide had become rough and patchy, with large areas where the hair had fallen away, revealing raw skin burned by the relentless sun that had tormented the creature for what must have been countless agonizing days. But what truly ignited a volcanic rage in Ezekiel's soul was not merely the deplorable condition of this innocent creature, but rather the deliberate and calculated nature of its torment. For this was no accident of nature or unfortunate circumstance, but the work of human hands, guided by a heart darker than the deepest mine shaft. Heavy iron chains that must have weighed nearly as much as the foal itself had been wrapped around his thin legs, with cruel precision, ensuring that the animal could neither stand properly nor lie down comfortably, condemning him to an existence of perpetual agony, where every movement brought fresh waves of pain. The chains had been there so long that they had cut deep grooves into the tender flesh, creating infected wounds that wept with pus, and attracted clouds of flies that tormented the helpless creature, further adding layers of misery to an already unbearable situation. As if the physical torture was not sufficient to satisfy the sadistic impulses of whoever had orchestrated this nightmare, there was a wooden sign nailed to the tree above the dying colt, with words burned into the grain with such deliberate care that it was clear someone had taken their time to ensure the message would be permanent and unmistakable. The roughly carved letters spelled out a sentence that made Ezekiel's blood run cold, despite the desert heat surrounding him from all sides, like the breath of hell itself. The sign read in cruel mockery of the suffering below it these words that would be forever burned into Ezekiel's memory, just as they had been burned into the wood itself. "Worthless colt, let him die here." And each letter seemed to pulse with the malevolence of whoever had taken the time to create this monument to cruelty. The colt's eyes, which should have sparkled with the curiosity and energy of youth, were now glassy with severe dehydration, and glazed with a pain so profound that it had transcended mere physical suffering and entered the realm of existential anguish. When those eyes turned toward Ezekiel, they carried within them a silent plea that struck the cowboy's soul with the force of a lightning bolt, splitting an ancient oak tree down to its roots. The small animal attempted to raise his head to better see this new arrival, this potential savior, or perhaps simply another tormentor come to witness his final moments. But the weight of the chains, combined with his extreme weakness, made even this simple gesture an act of heroism that spoke volumes about the indomitable spirit that somehow still flickered within this broken body. A strangled whimper escaped from his parched throat, a sound so pitiful and desperate that it would have moved the hardest heart to tears. And Ezekiel Martinez, despite his 54 years of living in a harsh world where softness could mean death, felt moisture gathering in his eyes as he witnessed this testament to human cruelty. What manner of monster could inflict such deliberate suffering upon an innocent creature? Ezekiel muttered through clenched teeth as fury built within him like a thunderstorm, gathering strength over the mountains. His fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white as bleached bones, and his weathered hands trembled, not with fear, but with a rage so pure and righteous that it seemed to make the very air around him crackle with electricity. Someone had made a calculated decision that this young colt did not deserve to live, had judged him worthless, and had chosen to condemn him to die in the most agonizing way possible, not with the quick mercy of a bullet, but with the slow torture of starvation, dehydration, and exposure. The deliberate cruelty of it, all the time and effort invested in creating this scene of suffering, spoke of a darkness in the human soul that Ezekiel had encountered before, but never to this extreme degree. But what Ezekiel was about to discover about the identity of the perpetrator and their motivations would unleash a chain of events that would send shockwaves through the entire Arizona territory and demonstrate that sometimes the universe has its own way of balancing the scales of justice. What you are about to hear is a true story that occurred in Cochise County, Arizona in the year 1889, during a time when the frontier was still wild and justice often came in forms that city folk might not recognize or understand. This is a tale that teaches us that evil deeds cast long shadows, but sometimes those shadows lead directly back to their source, and that kindness shown to the helpless and innocent is never forgotten by the forces that govern our world. Ezekiel Martinez was a weathered cowboy of 54 years who had witnessed much cruelty in his difficult life on the frontier, where survival often meant making hard choices, but never in all his years had he encountered something so deliberately malicious as what he found that scorching July day in the unforgiving desert. What he did not yet know was that his act of compassion toward this abandoned creature would set in motion events that the entire region would remember and speak of in hushed tones for generations to come. As we share this extraordinary story that has been passed down through the generations like a sacred text meant to remind us of our shared humanity, we are moved by the knowledge that these words reach hearts across the world, transcending borders, languages, and cultures to touch something universal within the human spirit. If this story is touching your soul, please know that you are witnessing a testament to the power of compassion and the mysterious ways in which justice sometimes manifests itself in our world. This is a story where the most heartless cruelty collides with the purest kindness, where a simple act of love toward a defenseless animal becomes the seed of a poetic justice that no one could have imagined or orchestrated through human planning alone. Because sometimes, in the Old West, and perhaps in all times and places, destiny has very particular ways of balancing the scales between good and evil, ensuring that no act of cruelty goes unnoticed and no act of kindness goes unrewarded. What happened to the man who abandoned that worthless colt would demonstrate with crystal clarity that nature itself keeps a ledger of our deeds, and that those who harm the innocent must eventually face a reckoning that comes from forces far greater than human law. Ezekiel's hands trembled with both urgency and barely contained rage as he searched through his worn leather saddlebags for tools strong enough to break the chains that bound this innocent creature. The colt had attempted once more to rise upon seeing him approach more closely, but was so weakened by his ordeal that he could barely keep his head raised for more than a few seconds before it would drop back down in exhaustion. The flanks of the young animal rose and fell, with labored breathing that rattled in his chest, and dozens of flies had settled upon the infected wounds where the chains had rubbed through skin and muscle, creating a feast of suffering that turned Ezekiel's stomach. The cowboy's voice was rough with emotion as he spoke to the colt in soothing tones, trying to communicate through tone rather than words that salvation had finally arrived after what must have seemed like an eternity of torment. "Easy there, young fellow," Ezekiel murmured, while his weathered hands finally closed around the strongest pair of cutting pliers he owned, tools that had served him well through years of fence repairs and equipment maintenance, but had never been put to a more important use than this moment. "Nobody is going to hurt you ever again, and I swear this upon my very soul and upon the graves of my ancestors who watch over me from beyond." The sign still hung there, like a cruel joke, mocking the suffering it had witnessed, and perhaps even celebrating it, as if the pain of this innocent creature was something to be proud of, rather than deeply ashamed of. The words, "worthless colt," seemed to pulse with malevolence in the harsh sunlight, and Ezekiel tore the sign down with such violent force that the aged wood splintered into pieces, which he then hurled as far as his strength would allow, wanting to remove every trace of the cruelty from this place. As he worked on the chains, taking care not to cause additional pain to the already traumatized animal, Ezekiel was able to examine the colt more closely and make a fuller assessment of his condition. Beyond the obvious malnutrition that had reduced the young animal to little more than skin stretched over bones, there was something else that explained the cruel label of worthless that had been assigned to him. One of his front legs showed a slight natural deformity, a gentle curve in the bone structure that would cause him to limp slightly when walking, but which in no way prevented him from moving or living a full life. So that was the reason for this attempted murder, Ezekiel thought, with bitterness rising in his throat, like bile, as the full picture became clear to him. A small imperfection in an otherwise healthy animal, a minor deviation from some arbitrary standard of perfection, and someone had decided that this gentle creature did not deserve to live, did not deserve even the mercy of a quick death, but instead should suffer slowly under the desert sun. The first chain link gave way with a metallic snap that sounded like a gunshot in the still desert air, causing the colt to flinch instinctively. But in his glazed eyes there was something new, something that made Ezekiel's heart swell with an emotion so powerful it threatened to overwhelm him completely. What he saw there was hope, pure and undiluted hope, that perhaps his suffering was truly coming to an end, that perhaps there was still goodness in a world that had shown him only cruelty. "That's right, little one. You're almost free now," Ezekiel whispered as he attacked the second chain with renewed determination, his muscles straining with the effort, but his resolve never wavering for even a moment. When the final chain fell to the ground, with a sound like the closing of a terrible chapter, the colt did something that Ezekiel would remember for the rest of his days, something that would come to him in quiet moments and remind him of why compassion matters more than any other human quality. With an effort that must have cost him nearly all his remaining strength, an effort that seemed to draw upon reserves of will that should have been long exhausted, the young colt managed to struggle to his feet, swaying dangerously, but refusing to fall. And then, in a gesture that transcended species and spoke to something universal in all living creatures, the colt pressed his head against Ezekiel's chest in what could only be described as pure gratitude mixed with absolute trust and unconditional love. The weight of that small head against his chest, the feeling of complete surrender and trust from a creature that had every reason to fear and hate humans, broke something inside Ezekiel, and he felt tears flowing freely down his weathered cheeks for the first time in many years. "Good Lord above, how could anyone do this to you?" Ezekiel murmured, as his calloused hands gently stroked the colt's neck, feeling every bone beneath the patchy coat, but also feeling the heart that still beat with determination despite everything. The cowboy gave water from his canteen, pouring it slowly into his cupped palm and offering it to the colt, who drank with a desperation that spoke of days without a single drop to ease his thirst. The young animal's tongue was swollen and cracked, but he lapped at the water with careful determination, as if he understood that drinking too quickly might make him sick, and he could not afford to waste this precious gift. After the water, Ezekiel offered oats from the supply he carried for his own horse, and the colt ate with a delicate grace that seemed at odds with his desperate hunger, taking small mouthfuls and chewing carefully as if savoring not just the food, but the kindness behind it. While the animal fed slowly and carefully, Ezekiel examined the wounds on his legs more closely, and what he found filled him with fresh waves of anger that threatened to consume him entirely. The marks were deep and badly infected, with clear signs that the chains had been in place for many days, perhaps even weeks, and that no one had shown even the slightest mercy by loosening them as the colt had grown weaker. The cruelty of it was so calculated, so deliberate, that it spoke of a mind that took pleasure in suffering, or at minimum felt nothing when inflicting it upon the innocent. "I'm going to call you Miracle Ezekiel," decided, as his hands continued their gentle ministrations on the colt's neck and shoulders, trying to offer comfort through touch to communicate that he was safe now that the nightmare was finally over. "Because that's exactly what you are, a miracle that came into my life at a moment when I needed to be reminded that there is still purpose in showing kindness in a harsh world." The journey back to the ranch was slow and revealed much about the character of both the man and the animal he had rescued from certain death. Despite his severe limp and extreme weakness, Miracle showed incredible determination, never complaining, through sounds or behavior, never giving up, even when the path became difficult, and seeming to understand every word that Ezekiel spoke to him during their long journey home. The cowboy had fashioned a makeshift lead from soft rope, being careful not to put any pressure on the wounded legs, and Miracle followed with complete trust, never pulling back or showing fear, despite what humans had done to him. When they finally arrived at the ranch, as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that seemed to celebrate their arrival, Maria, who was Ezekiel's wife of 23 years, came running from the house when she saw the condition of the animal they were bringing home. "Ezekiel, dear God in heaven, what did they do to this poor creature?" Maria exclaimed as her hands flew to her mouth in shock at the sight of the emaciated and wounded colt, who stood swaying slightly, but still maintaining his dignity despite everything he had endured. "It's a long story, Maria, and one that makes me question the humanity of some folks, but this little fellow is going to be fine. Now I promise you that on everything I hold sacred," Ezekiel replied as he helped support Miracle, while Maria ran to fetch medical supplies and fresh water. That night, as they carefully cleaned and treated Miracle's wounds and settled him into the most comfortable stall in their barn, with fresh hay and plenty of water within easy reach, Ezekiel could not stop thinking about who had been capable of such calculated cruelty. The sign had not appeared from nowhere, and someone had planned this. Torture had made the deliberate decision that it was better to let an innocent animal die slowly and painfully rather than give him even the smallest chance at life. Maria spoke softly as they stood watching Miracle finally sleep deeply, for what was probably the first time in weeks, his breathing steady and peaceful now that he was safe. "Tomorrow I'm going to town, and I'm going to ask around because someone must know who did this, and they need to be held accountable for their actions. You be careful, Ezekiel, because anyone capable of doing this to a defenseless animal is capable of anything, and there's no telling what they might do if they feel threatened," Maria warned with concern, evident in her voice, as she placed a gentle hand on her husband's arm. What neither of them knew in that moment was that they would not have to search very far for answers, because the very next day the author of this cruelty would appear at their ranch, and what would happen next would be a demonstration that divine justice sometimes arrives in the most unexpected ways. That night Ezekiel stayed awake for many hours, sitting on a wooden stool near Miracle's stall, and watching the young colt sleep, while feeling a strange sense of peace settling over him like a warm blanket. It was as if fate itself had sent this small being into his life to remind him that there was still goodness in the world worth fighting for. But he also felt a cold determination growing in his chest, like ice forming on a winter pond. Whoever had done this would pay one way or another, because some crimes against innocence could not go unanswered without the very fabric of morality beginning to unravel. 3 weeks had passed since the rescue, and Miracle's transformation was nothing short of astonishing to all who witnessed it. His bay coat had regained its natural shine and luster, and his eyes sparkled with life and intelligence that spoke of a spirit that had never truly been broken, despite the attempts to destroy it. Though he maintained his characteristic limp from the deformity in his leg, Ezekiel had discovered that this small imperfection did not prevent him from moving with a unique grace that made him special rather than defective. The wounds on his legs were healing well under Maria's careful attention, and though they would leave permanent scars, these marks would serve as reminders of his strength rather than symbols of his suffering. Each day brought new improvements and new revelations about Miracle's gentle nature and remarkable intelligence, as he seemed to understand human speech with an uncanny ability and showed affection to everyone who approached him with kindness. But the peace of their small ranch was shattered when a man arrived riding a magnificent black horse and followed by 2 armed cowboys whose hands rested meaningfully on the butts of their pistols in a clear show of intimidation. The leader of this group sat tall in his saddle, wearing expensive clothes that marked him as a wealthy landowner, but his eyes were as cold and cruel as those of a rattlesnake preparing to strike. "Are you Ezekiel Martinez?" the man asked, in a voice as rough as sandpaper that seemed to grate against the very air itself. "That's me. So what can I do for you?" Ezekiel responded, while instinctively sensing that trouble had just arrived at his doorstep in the form of this well-dressed stranger with the serpent's gaze. "My name is Marcus Dalton, and I own the Triple D Ranch to the north of here, the largest spread in 3 counties, the man declared, with an arrogance that dripped from every word like poison from a viper's fangs. "I heard through the grapevine that you found a bay colt in the desert some weeks back, and I've come to reclaim my property." Ezekiel's heart began to race, but he maintained his outward calm, not wanting to give this man any advantage in what was clearly about to become a confrontation. "And what exactly would that matter to you, Mr. Dalton, if you don't mind my asking?" "That colt belongs to me," Dalton declared, with icy certainty that brooked no argument, as if his word alone was law in these parts. "He escaped from my property and wandered off into the desert, and I've come to take him back where he belongs." The word "escaped" hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Ezekiel felt rage beginning to boil in his veins like lava seeking release from a volcano. "He escaped, you say? Well, that's interesting, because I found him chained with heavy iron chains, and with a sign that said, 'Worthless colt, let him die here.' So perhaps you'd like to explain how he managed to escape while wearing those chains." For the first time since his arrival, Dalton appeared slightly uncomfortable, shifting in his saddle, but he quickly recovered his composure, and his cruel demeanor returned even stronger than before. "I don't know about any sign, old man, and frankly, I don't care what you think you found," Dalton said, with a dismissive wave of his hand. That colt has a defect in his leg that makes him useless for any real work, so he's worthless to me as breeding stock or as a working animal, but he's still mine by legal right." "If he's so worthless to you, then why do you want him back?" Ezekiel asked, while taking a deliberate step forward, his body language making it clear he would not be intimidated by this man or his armed escorts. Dalton laughed then, and it was a sound completely devoid of warmth or humor, a sound that would chill the blood of anyone with a functioning conscience. "I have my reasons, old-timer, and maybe I want to use him for target practice with my boys here, since a horse that can't run properly makes a perfect stationary target for improving our marksmanship." The words hit Ezekiel like physical blows, each one revealing more about the true nature of the man standing before him. This monster had not only abandoned Miracle to die in the most cruel way possible, but now, upon learning that the colt had survived, he was planning to use him as a living target for shooting practice. The casualness with which he spoke of ending an innocent life for sport revealed a soul so corrupted that it seemed barely human anymore. "You will not lay a single hand on that colt," Ezekiel growled in a voice so dangerously low that it seemed to come from the very depths of the earth itself. "Not now and not ever as long as I draw breath on this earth. Are you challenging me?" Old Man Dalton sneered while making a gesture to his men, who immediately moved their hands to rest on their pistol grips in a clear threat of violence. "That animal belongs to me by law, and I can call the sheriff if necessary to enforce my legal rights of ownership." "Then call him," Ezekiel said without backing down even an inch, his own hand moving to rest on the rifle he had leaned against the fence post earlier. "I would love nothing more than to explain to him exactly how I found your animal dying, while chained and abandoned in the desert with clear evidence of deliberate torture." At that precise moment, as if summoned by the tension in the air, or perhaps by some deeper instinct, Miracle appeared from behind the barn, where he had been grazing peacefully in the shade. When the young colt's eyes fell upon Dalton, something extraordinary and unprecedented occurred that left all witnesses stunned. The colt, who had always been docile and friendly with everyone he met, underwent a complete transformation that was shocking in its intensity. His eyes filled with a terror so pure and profound that it seemed to pierce the very soul, but this terror quickly transformed into something Ezekiel had never witnessed in an animal before. It was fury, pure, righteous fury, directed at the man who had caused him so much suffering. Miracle began to whinny, with an intensity that made everyone present step back involuntarily, for this was not the sound of a normal horse, but something almost supernatural in its power and emotion. This was not mere fear, but recognition combined with a hatred so pure that it seemed to charge the very air with electricity. The colt's entire body trembled with the force of his emotion, and his eyes never left Dalton's face, as if he was burning the image of his tormentor into his memory forever. "There's the worthless piece of horseflesh," Dalton exclaimed with sadistic satisfaction that made Ezekiel's stomach turn with disgust. "Look how agitated he gets just from seeing me, which proves he was always a problematic animal that needed to be dealt with severely." But what happened next left everyone present completely speechless and would be talked about in the region for years to come, as witnesses struggled to explain what they had seen. Despite his limp and his smaller size, Miracle charged directly toward Dalton with a determination so fierce that it seemed to come from a place beyond normal animal behavior. His eyes no longer showed the terror of a victim, but the righteous fury of a being confronting its abuser with all the courage that had been building during weeks of recovery and care. The sight of the small colt charging with such intensity despite his physical limitations was so unexpected and powerful that Dalton's expensive black horse, who had probably never shown fear in its life, reared violently in panic. The sudden movement was so extreme that Dalton, who had been focused on Miracle rather than controlling his mount, was thrown from the saddle with tremendous force, landing hard on the packed earth with a sound that echoed across the ranch yard. The wealthy rancher lay sprawled in the dust, his expensive clothes now covered in dirt, and his dignity completely shattered as he struggled to understand what had just happened. "Control that damned animal!" Dalton screamed from the ground, his face red with humiliation and rage, as he struggled to regain his feet, while his men looked on uncertainly, not sure whether to help their boss or deal with the colt. "I can't control justice itself," Ezekiel replied with a cold smile that held no warmth whatsoever, only satisfaction at seeing a cruel man brought low by the very creature he had tormented. "And that colt has every right in this world, and the next, to be furious with you for what you did to him." The two ranch hands working for Dalton drew their weapons, then their pistols clearing leather with practiced ease. But before they could aim, Maria had appeared on the porch with a rifle trained directly at them, her stance showing she knew exactly how to use it. "I suggest you gentlemen rethink your actions and leave immediately," Maria said in a firm voice that carried across the yard with crystal clarity, leaving no doubt that she meant every word. "This is our ranch, and that colt is now part of our family, and we protect our own with everything we have." Dalton struggled to his feet, his face twisted with fury and humiliation as he brushed the dust from his clothes with violent swipes of his hands. The situation had completely reversed from what he had expected when he arrived with his show of force and wealth. He was now outnumbered, and had lost any psychological advantage he might have possessed when he rode in with his armed escort. "This is not over Martinez. Not by a long shot," Dalton growled, as he retrieved his hat from the dirt and slapped it against his leg to remove the dust. "That animal belongs to me legally, and I will recover what is mine, one way or another, mark my words. The only thing that's going to be recovered here is justice, and something tells me it's already started its work," Ezekiel replied while keeping his hand near his rifle, just in case Dalton's men decided to try something foolish. As Dalton and his men mounted their horses and rode away, Miracle gradually calmed down, but remained close to Ezekiel, as if protecting the man who had saved him from certain death. It was clear that the colt had recognized not only his abuser, but also understood on some deep level who his true family was now. "Easy there, boy," Ezekiel whispered, while stroking Miracle's neck, feeling the rapid heartbeat gradually slow as the danger passed. "That man is never going to hurt you again, and I promise you that on my life and on everything I hold sacred in this world." But that night, as Ezekiel kept watch from his window, unable to shake the feeling that danger still lurked in the darkness, he could not help but feel that Dalton would return, and when he did, he would be prepared for war. Dalton did indeed return 3 days later, but not in the manner Ezekiel had expected or prepared for. This time he came alone, and on foot, stumbling under the blazing midday sun, with his clothing torn to shreds, and dried blood caking his face and hands. His expensive boots were worn through, and his feet left bloody prints in the dust, as he staggered toward the ranch house like a man who had seen the very gates of hell itself. "Help me," he cried out, in a voice made hoarse by thirst and what sounded like hours of screaming. "Please, for the love of God, I need help before it's too late." Ezekiel emerged from the ranch house with his rifle in hand, while Maria stayed on the porch, ready for any trick or deception. But when they saw Dalton's condition, they realized something terrible and extraordinary had occurred. The man who had ridden away 3 days ago, full of arrogance and threats, was now reduced to a shell of his former self, and in his eyes was a terror that spoke of an experience beyond normal human understanding. "What happened to you?" Ezekiel asked, while maintaining a safe distance, not yet ready to trust that this wasn't some elaborate deception designed to lower their guard. Dalton fell to his knees in the dust, his body shaking with exhaustion and something else that looked very much like profound shock. It was a nightmare beyond anything I could have imagined, Dalton gasped, while looking up at them with eyes that had seen something that had shattered his understanding of how the world worked. All of my horses went completely insane, as if possessed by something beyond this world. What do you mean they went insane? Ezekiel pressed, while moving slightly closer, but keeping his rifle ready just in case this was indeed some kind of trap. Dalton raised his head, and in his eyes was a terror so profound that Ezekiel knew instantly this was no deception, because no one could fake the kind of existential horror he saw reflected there. After I left here, I returned to my ranch furious about being humiliated in front of my men, and I decided to take out my anger on the other defective colts I had collected. The blood in Ezekiel's veins turned to ice at these words, and he had to restrain himself from immediate violence. What exactly did you do, Dalton? I chained them all 6 young colts with minor defects that made them worthless in my eyes. Dalton continued, his voice breaking, with what might have been the first genuine emotion, other than cruelty, he had felt in years. I was going to do the same thing I did with the bay colt, abandon them in the desert, to die slowly as a lesson to all the other animals about what happens to those who don't meet my standards. You monster, Maria whispered with disgust so profound that the words seemed to hang in the air like a curse upon Dalton's very existence. But then something impossible happened, something that defies all logic and reason. Dalton continued while his whole body shook with the memory of what he had witnessed. The adult horses in my ranch, all of them from the oldest mare to the youngest stallion, organized themselves as if they were humans with a shared purpose and intelligence. They broke down the doors of their stalls using coordinated force that should have been impossible for animals acting on instinct alone. They freed the chained colts, working together to break the chains, with their hooves and teeth showing a level of cooperation I've never seen in my 30 years of working with horses. And then, after they had freed every single colt, they turned on me not to kill me, but to teach me a lesson I'll never forget, as long as I live. They surrounded me like a pack of wolves and pursued me for hours through the desert, making me feel exactly what those colts must have felt: the terror, the desperation, the complete abandonment and helplessness. Every time I tried to return to the ranch or reach water, they would drive me away, and I realized they were making me experience the same slow torture I had inflicted on those innocent animals. At that moment, Miracle emerged from the barn where he had been resting in the cool shade, and when he saw Dalton, there was no fury in his eyes this time. Instead, there was something that took everyone's breath away, and would be remembered as perhaps the most remarkable moment in this entire, extraordinary tale. The colt's eyes reflected something that should have been impossible after everything he had suffered at this man's hands. It was compassion, pure and genuine compassion for the broken man kneeling in the dust. Miracle approached slowly and with great dignity, each step deliberate and measured despite his permanent limp. When he reached Dalton, he gently touched the man's forehead with his soft muzzle in a gesture of forgiveness so profound that it seemed to transcend the boundaries between species and speak to something universal in all living beings. Why, Dalton whispered as tears began streaming down his face, carving channels through the dirt and blood that covered his features. Why would you forgive me after everything I did to you, after I tried to kill you in the cruelest way possible? Ezekiel stepped forward, then understanding that he was witnessing something sacred and transformative that few humans ever get to observe. Because he is what you never could be on your own, Marcus. He is noble and understands that revenge doesn't heal wounds, but forgiveness does. That forgiveness is not weakness, but the ultimate strength, because it breaks the cycle of cruelty and creates the possibility for redemption, even in the darkest of souls. Dalton broke down completely, then sobbing like a child who had finally understood the magnitude of his crimes against innocence and beauty. I've lost everything, he wept, while remaining on his knees in the dust, as if he didn't deserve to stand in the presence of those he had wronged. My horses all ran away and disappeared into the desert. My ranch hands abandoned me when they heard what I had been doing to the young colts, and the entire town has turned against me when word spread of my cruelty. I have nothing left, no possessions, no reputation, no friends, and no future that I can see. You have one thing, Ezekiel said in words that surprised even Maria, who had been his partner through decades of hard living. You have an opportunity, a chance to become better than you were, to transform your cruelty into compassion and your hatred into love. Would you give me work? Dalton asked with a voice so broken and humble that it was hard to reconcile with the arrogant man who had ridden up just 3 days before. After everything I've done, after all the evil I've brought into this world, you would consider giving me a chance to make amends. Ezekiel looked at Miracle, who still stood beside the fallen man, offering comfort to his former tormentor, and found his answer in the wise and forgiving eyes of the young colt. Miracle is giving you a second chance at being human, Marcus, and who am I to deny what this noble creature has decided in his infinite wisdom? If he can forgive you, then I can give you the opportunity to earn that forgiveness through actions rather than just words. 2 years passed, and in that time Marcus Dalton became a completely different human being, as if the man who had tortured innocent animals had died in the desert that day and been reborn as someone capable of genuine compassion and love. He worked on Ezekiel's ranch with dedication that bordered on devotion, especially caring for injured and abandoned animals that people brought from all over the county, having heard of the ranch's reputation as a sanctuary for the broken and unwanted. His former cruelty had been replaced by a deep compassion that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, born from the forgiveness of a colt he had tried to destroy and nurtured by the patient guidance of Ezekiel and Maria. Miracle had become the heart and soul of the ranch, bringing joy to everyone who met him and serving as a living reminder that physical imperfections mean nothing compared to the perfection of a noble spirit. His limp never disappeared, but no one who knew him saw it as a defect anymore, but rather as part of what made him unique and special, a badge of honor that showed his triumph over cruelty and his capacity for forgiveness. On quiet evenings, when the desert air was cool and the stars emerged like diamonds scattered across black velvet, Ezekiel would watch Dalton gently brushing Miracle's coat while whispering words of gratitude and love to the animal who had saved his soul. In these moments, the old cowboy understood that he had witnessed something extraordinary, not just the rescue of an abandoned colt, but the transformation of evil into good through the mysterious alchemy of forgiveness and grace. The story spread throughout the territory and beyond, carried by travelers and cowboys who had heard it from those who witnessed these events firsthand. It became a legend that parents told their children around campfires, a tale that reminded people that cruelty creates its own punishment, while kindness generates rewards beyond our imagination. Some claimed the organizing of Dalton's horses had been coincidence or exaggeration, but those who had been there knew better. They had seen something that suggested the universe itself takes notice when innocence is tortured, and sometimes intervenes in ways that defy rational explanation but satisfy a deeper sense of justice that exists in the very fabric of creation. And so, dear readers, this remarkable story comes to its conclusion, though its lessons echo through time like ripples on a still pond, reaching shores we cannot see. This tale teaches us that sometimes the most powerful justice is not vengeance but forgiveness, and that the ability to forgive those who have wronged us most grievously is perhaps the greatest strength any being can possess. Miracle, The worthless colt proved that true miracles occur when we choose to heal rather than hurt, when we offer compassion where others would demand revenge, and when we recognize that every living being, regardless of their imperfections, deserves the chance to know love and kindness. Marcus Dalton learned that real strength does not come from dominating the weak, but from protecting them, and that a man's worth is not measured by his possessions or power, but by his capacity to change and grow and become better than he was. Ezekiel Martinez discovered that rescuing an abandoned animal can sometimes lead to rescuing a human soul that had lost its way in darkness, and that the act of showing mercy can create ripples that transform entire communities. We share this legend with deep reverence for its profound truth that in a world that often seems dominated by cruelty and indifference, individual acts of kindness matter more than we can possibly imagine. Which moment in this extraordinary tale touched your heart most deeply? Was it the initial scene of cruelty that sparked righteous anger in your soul? Was it the moment of rescue when Ezekiel chose compassion over indifference? Or perhaps it was that magical instant when Miracle forgave the very man who had tried to destroy him, showing us that forgiveness is not just possible, but transformative in ways that transcend human understanding. If this story has stirred something within your heart, remember that the Old West, and indeed all of human history, is filled with lessons like this, where goodness triumphs, not through force or violence, but through the invincible power of love, compassion, and forgiveness. These stories remind us that we always have a choice in how we respond to the suffering we witness, and that choosing kindness, even when it seems foolish or dangerous, can set in motion forces that reshape the world around us in ways we never could have predicted or planned. Until we meet again in another tale from the frontier, never forget that in a world that often wounds us deeply, choosing to forgive rather than seeking revenge does not make us weak, but transforms us into living miracles capable of breaking cycles of cruelty that have persisted for generations. Remember that every act of kindness toward the helpless and innocent is witnessed by forces greater than we can comprehend, and that these acts create ripples that extend far beyond what our limited human perspective can perceive. The story of Miracle reminds us that sometimes those society deems worthless possess the greatest worth of all, and that true nobility has nothing to do with physical perfection, but everything to do with the capacity to love and forgive, even those who have given us every reason to hate. May you carry the spirit of miracle with you in your own life, remembering that we all have the power to be miracles for others, simply by choosing compassion over cruelty and forgiveness over vengeance. And may you never forget that in the grand tapestry of existence, every thread matters. And sometimes the most frayed and imperfect threads create the most beautiful and meaningful patterns in the whole design of creation itself. The years that followed brought many changes to that corner of Arizona as the frontier slowly gave way to civilization and the wild lands became tamed by the steady march of progress. The railroad came through, bringing with it newcomers who had heard the story of Miracle and traveled great distances just to see the famous colt who had transformed from a condemned creature into a symbol of hope and redemption. Children would gather at the fence line of Ezekiel's ranch, their eyes wide with wonder, as they watched Miracle grazing peacefully in the pasture, his distinctive limp making him easy to identify, even from a distance. Parents would tell them the story again and again, using it as a teaching tool to help their children understand that everyone deserves kindness regardless of their imperfections, and that the power to forgive is the greatest strength any person can possess. Marcus Dalton continued his work at the ranch, eventually becoming known throughout the territory as the man who could heal the most traumatized and abused animals. Horses that others had given up on would be brought to him, and through infinite patience and genuine love, he would slowly earn their trust and help them remember that not all humans were sources of pain. His transformation was so complete that newcomers to the area who had not known him before could never believe the stories of his former cruelty, finding it impossible to reconcile the gentle, compassionate man they knew with the monster described in the legend. This dichotomy served as a powerful reminder that people are capable of profound change when given the opportunity and shown the way through example and forgiveness. As Miracle grew older, his wisdom seemed to deepen, and he became something of a sage among the animals at the ranch. Younger horses would seek him out when they were frightened or confused, and he would stand with them, offering the quiet comfort of his presence until their fears subsided. Even the ranch dogs would curl up beside him on cold nights, drawing warmth not just from his body, but from the peaceful aura that seemed to surround him at all times. Ezekiel often remarked that Miracle had become more than just a horse, but had transformed into a living embodiment of the principle that love conquers hate and that forgiveness can heal even the deepest wounds. The local newspaper eventually picked up the story, and it spread beyond the territory, reaching cities in the East, where it was published in magazines and discussed in churches as an example of divine intervention in the affairs of men. Some skeptics tried to explain away the supernatural elements, particularly the organized rebellion of Dalton's horses. But those who had witnessed the events knew that some truths transcend rational explanation and speak to mysteries that lie at the heart of existence itself. The story became part of the folklore of the American West, joining the canon of tales that defined the spirit of the frontier, where justice often came in unexpected forms, and where the relationship between humans and animals could reveal profound truths about the nature of good and evil. Maria, who had initially been skeptical about allowing Dalton to work on their ranch, became one of his strongest advocates, witnessing firsthand his genuine transformation and dedication to making amends for his past cruelty. She would often work alongside him, teaching him her methods for treating wounded animals and sharing the wisdom she had accumulated over decades of ranch life. Their unlikely friendship became another thread in the tapestry of redemption that was being woven at the Martinez Ranch, and served as proof that forgiveness, when genuine, can bridge even the widest chasms between people. On special occasions, when the moon was full and the desert was bathed in silver light, Ezekiel would saddle up his old horse and take Miracle for gentle walks through the surrounding landscape. The colt, who had grown into a strong and beautiful horse despite his limp, would follow without needing to be led, understanding that these nocturnal journeys were something sacred between them. During these walks, Ezekiel would talk to Miracle about life and death, about cruelty and kindness, about the mysteries that bind all living things together in an invisible web of connection. And though Miracle could not respond in words, the old cowboy knew that on some level deeper than language, the horse understood everything and offered his own wisdom through his presence and unconditional love. The impact of Miracle's story extended far beyond the immediate circle of those who knew him personally. Other ranchers in the region began to reconsider their treatment of animals deemed imperfect or worthless. Where once a colt with a deformity might have been immediately destroyed, it became common practice to give such animals a chance to prove their worth in other ways. This shift in attitude represented a small but significant evolution in the consciousness of the frontier communities, a movement away from purely utilitarian views of animals toward a recognition of their intrinsic value as sentient beings deserving of compassion and respect. Schools in the area began inviting Ezekiel to speak to students about his experience with Miracle, using the story as a powerful lesson in empathy and moral courage. The old cowboy, who had never considered himself a public speaker, found that when he told the story of finding that chained and dying colt in the desert, words flowed from him with an eloquence he had never possessed before. Children would sit transfixed as he described the transformation of both Miracle and Marcus Dalton, and many would leave these presentations with a new understanding of their responsibility to protect and care for those who cannot protect themselves. As the seasons turned and years accumulated like layers of sediment, forming the bedrock of legend, Miracle's influence continued to ripple outward, touching lives in ways that no one could have predicted when Ezekiel first cut those chains in the desert. Visitors would arrive at the ranch from distant places, bringing their own stories of animals who had shown extraordinary forgiveness, or humans who had experienced profound transformation through acts of kindness toward creatures they had previously dismissed as worthless. These stories created a kind of congregation of believers in the power of compassion to transform the world one act at a time, and the Martinez Ranch became an unofficial pilgrimage site for those seeking to understand the deeper meanings hidden within the relationship between humans and animals. Even the local indigenous peoples, who had their own ancient stories about the sacred bonds between humans and horses, recognized something special in Miracle's tale. Elders would nod knowingly when they heard the story of Dalton's horses organizing to teach him a lesson, saying that such things were not surprising to those who understood that all of creation is connected by threads of spirit that become visible only when great injustice or great love disturbs their normal hidden patterns. They saw in Miracle's forgiveness of his tormentor an echo of their own spiritual traditions, which emphasized the circular nature of existence and the importance of breaking cycles of vengeance through acts of radical compassion. The story also had profound effects on the practice of law in the territory. Judges began considering cases of animal cruelty with greater seriousness, recognizing that such acts were not merely property crimes, but offenses against the moral order itself. Lawyers would reference the case of Miracle when arguing for stricter penalties for those who abused animals, and gradually the legal framework evolved to provide better protection for creatures who could not speak for themselves in human courts. This legal evolution was perhaps one of the most lasting impacts of Miracle's story, transforming abstract principles of justice into concrete protections that would benefit countless animals for generations to come. Marcus Dalton eventually wrote his own account of his transformation, which was published in newspapers throughout the West as a cautionary tale and testament to the possibility of redemption. In his writing, he did not shy away from describing the depths of his former cruelty, acknowledging that he had been a monster who took pleasure in causing suffering to innocent beings. But he also wrote eloquently about the moment when Miracle had touched his forehead with forgiveness, describing it as feeling like a door opening in his soul that had been locked and barred for so long he had forgotten it existed. His written testimony became a powerful tool for reaching others who might be on similar paths of cruelty, showing them that it was never too late to change direction and seek redemption through service to those they had wronged. The economic impact of the story was also significant, as the Martinez Ranch became famous throughout the territory for producing horses with exceptional temperament and character. People would pay premium prices for horses that had been trained using the methods of patience and kindness that Ezekiel and Maria had developed and refined through their work with Miracle and other rescued animals. This success proved that compassion was not just morally superior to cruelty, but could also be more profitable in practical terms, as horses raised with love and respect became more valuable than those broken through fear and domination. This economic dimension of the story helped convince even the most hard-headed ranchers that there were practical as well as ethical reasons to treat animals with greater kindness and respect. As Miracle entered his twilight years, he moved with the dignity of an elder statesman among horses, and his presence at the ranch took on an almost mystical quality. Animals and humans alike seemed to sense that they were in the presence of something special when near him, and even the most agitated or frightened creatures would calm in his presence as if absorbing some of his hard-won peace. Ezekiel built a special shelter for him near the main house so that Miracle could spend his final years in maximum comfort, surrounded by those who loved him and protected by the family he had helped to transform through his example of forgiveness and grace. When news spread that Miracle was aging and would not have many more years, people began arriving at the ranch to pay their respects to the horse who had become a living legend. They brought offerings of apples and carrots and sugar cubes, and many brought their children so that they could say they had met the famous Miracle, whose story had touched so many lives. Some visitors were overcome with emotion when they saw him standing peacefully in his paddock, his coat still gleaming despite his advanced age, and his eyes still holding that spark of wisdom and compassion that had characterized him from the day Ezekiel had first saved him. The final chapter of Miracle's earthly existence came on a peaceful spring morning when the desert was in bloom and the air was filled with the scent of wildflowers. Ezekiel found him lying peacefully in his favorite spot under an old cottonwood tree and knew immediately that Miracle had chosen his moment to depart this world. There was no sign of struggle or suffering, just a sense of completion, as if Miracle had decided that his work was done, and it was time to move on to whatever mysteries awaited beyond the veil of death. The old cowboy sat with him for hours, holding his head and speaking softly about all the lives that had been changed because of one small colt who had refused to let cruelty define his existence. The funeral for Miracle was unlike anything the territory had ever seen, with hundreds of people arriving to pay their respects to a horse who had become a symbol of hope and transformation. Marcus Dalton spoke at the service, his voice breaking with emotion as he described how Miracle's forgiveness had saved him from a life of cruelty and given him the chance to become the man he was always meant to be. Children placed wildflowers on the grave, and adults stood in respectful silence, understanding that they were witnessing the end of an era, but also the continuation of a legacy that would outlive them all. The local priest, who had initially been skeptical about holding a formal service for an animal, found himself moved to tears as he spoke about the mysterious ways in which the divine manifests in the world and how sometimes angels come in forms we do not expect. In the days and weeks that followed Miracle's passing, something remarkable happened at the ranch. Animals began arriving seemingly from nowhere, as if called by some invisible signal that humans could not perceive. Injured birds would appear at the doorstep, horses, with nowhere else to go, would show up at the gate, and even wild creatures would approach the ranch with unusual trust, as if they somehow knew this was a place of sanctuary. Ezekiel and Maria understood that this was Miracle's final gift, that his spirit had somehow marked this place as sacred ground where the wounded could find healing and the lost could find home. Marcus Dalton continued his work at the ranch for the rest of his days, becoming in time as beloved in the community as he had once been despised. He never forgot the lesson Miracle had taught him and devoted his life to paying forward the forgiveness he had received by showing boundless compassion to every creature that crossed his path. When he finally passed away many years later, he was buried near Miracle at his own request, and the inscription on his gravestone read simply, "Forgiven and transformed by grace," a testament to the power of redemption that had been demonstrated so powerfully in his life. The ranch itself became a permanent sanctuary for animals in need, funded by donations from people whose lives had been touched by Miracle's story, and managed by a succession of caretakers who understood and preserved the principles of compassion that had been established there. Educational programs were developed to teach children about empathy and kindness, using Miracle's story as the cornerstone of the curriculum, and thousands of young people over the years learned that true strength comes not from dominating others, but from having the courage to show mercy even to those who may not deserve it. Today, if you travel to that part of Arizona and know where to look, you can still find the Martinez Ranch, though it has grown and evolved far beyond what Ezekiel and Maria could have imagined. The old cottonwood tree where Miracle spent his final moments still stands, and beneath it is a simple stone marker that bears his name and the dates of his life, along with the inscription, "Here lies proof that love conquers all." Visitors still come from around the world to see this place where a single act of compassion set in motion events that changed countless lives and demonstrated that miracles are not always grand supernatural events, but sometimes simple acts of kindness that ripple outward in ways we cannot predict or control. And so the story of Miracle continues to be told, passed down through generations, like a sacred trust, reminding us that in a world often darkened by cruelty, there is always the possibility of transformation through love. It reminds us that those whom society deems worthless may possess the greatest worth of all, and that the power to forgive those who have wronged us is perhaps the most divine quality any being can possess. The legend of the colt who was left to die in chains, but who chose to forgive his tormentor, stands as an eternal testament to the triumph of compassion over cruelty and the mysterious ways in which the universe conspires to balance the scales of justice, not through vengeance, but through the transformative power of unconditional love and forgiveness that transcends all understanding.